family or the kids, and so our numbers fluctuate a good bit during this time. But we're grateful that you're here. Look forward to a good discussion tonight and hope that it's encouraging for you, certainly in our time of study here and even with our time of fellowship as we've been enjoying and will enjoy when we finish up in just a few moments. Once again, just to kind of give you an idea of where we've been, where we're going just for the next few weeks, we're going to talk about gossip tonight. Next week, discipline. I'll be honest, I haven't looked that far ahead to tell you exactly what route that will go as far as if that is more along the lines of church discipline or more along the lines of self-discipline. I have a feeling it'll be about both probably to some degree, so you can be thinking about that. Forgiveness and ingratitude will finish us out in this particular study, and then we will pick up in the new year with a new study and look forward to that. So how do you handle? And tonight we're going to look at how do you handle gossip. We're going to try to define that in just a moment. I hope that you'll be thinking about that. I'd like some feedback because I've got a few different definitions, and the more that I listened to and studied and thought about this, it varies a good bit. It goes kind of several different directions, and so I'd like for you to be thinking about that. But as we try to do each week, we'll have a little bit of a laugh here to begin. This one says, don't worry, your secret is safe with me. Everyone I told swore they wouldn't tell anyone else, right? The way it goes. So, by the way, this is not meant to be an attack on women, even if women are in most of the pictures here. I'm just going to say that up front. We'll say more about that in just a moment. But that's the way it goes. This one's my favorite one, though, that I found. But it says, I don't like to gossip, but, and then it all comes pouring out, right? That's the way a lot of people treat it. That kind of the old, saying we have around here of saying, bless your heart. As long as you say bless your heart, you can say whatever you want to say about somebody. So I don't like to gossip, but, and the truth of the matter is I was kind of, again, studying several different preachers and lessons and the book that I have to begin with and listening to several preachers and other, that kind of thing. One of the things that came up a few different times was this idea that over the years, we have taken the idea of gossip and we've made some different jokes about it, right? It kind of becomes a thing that we laugh about, whether it's the kind of the age-old thing, again, of, all the women in the salon, right? Everybody goes to get the hair done and goes to the beauty salon so they can find out all the gossip. And especially in a small southern town, everybody knows everybody else, and you go to get your hair done, you can find out everything about what everybody else is going on in their lives. Or maybe it's further along the line of the water cooler, right? You think about whether it's men in this picture here, because again, not just focusing on women, but men or whoever it might be, you have a certain location. And so we talk about water cooler talk or what people, the way people go and they interact together. And that's the place where you can go to find all the good gossip. Or even, right, some of you may remember the hee-haw days, right? The old song that said, I'm just doing a little bit of gossip, right? It's just a little bit, I'm not trying to gossip, but once again, that idea of I'm going to say, kind of clear myself with this statement, but, and here's some of the gossip that's going on. And, I don't mean to kind of start off on a real sad note here, just kind of be mean and harsh off the bat, but the truth is that we have sort of through the years and through lots of different caricatures or whatever it might be, made jokes about gossip and set up situations in which gossip takes place, or the kind of people who participate in gossip. And it's kind of meant to be funny sometimes, but the truth is we're going to try to look at tonight, it's a very serious thing. It's very serious when we think about what God says about gossip. And I know, again, I like to laugh as much as the next person, and we cut up about things and that kind of thing, but we would probably be wise to be careful when we talk about certain things. Nobody would ever joke about murder, right? Most of the time, none of us would sit around and laugh about murder. But what about other sins or other things? If we're trying to be as consistent as we can be, then we kind of need to think about that when we're talking about certain things. To kind of bounce off of that, I'd like to notice two things to begin that remind us that this is very serious. First of all, if you have a Bible, we'll be in Leviticus chapter 19. Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 16, to remind ourselves or to let us know off the bat, not that it's something you haven't thought about before, but it's not meant to be taken lightly. It's not something that's to be kind of looked over or not a big deal. But a couple of things to notice to begin with from God's Word. The first thing is that it has always been a part of God's law for mankind, the way that God wants His people to live. If I ask you, what do you think is covered in the book of Leviticus, we'd probably come up with a lot of things. But we'd probably start with, priests. We'd probably start with meat, right? Sacrifices and that kind of thing. But there are a lot of daily living things that are included in there as well. Verse 16 says, you shall not go about as a talebearer. That's an important word we're going to talk a lot about tonight. A talebearer among your people. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 16, part A there. Look around. If you have your Bible open there, you'll look at some other things just in chapter 19 alone. You go back to chapter 18, and there's a lot of things about sexual morality. My Bible has that heading. Chapter 19, verse 13, you shall not cheat your neighbor nor rob him. Verse 11, you shall not steal nor deal falsely nor lie to one another. Verse 18, you shall not take vengeance. Again, just all of these things are, I point out to remind ourselves that included in that is this idea of not being a talebearer, not being a gossip. Another word that's going to come up, of course, depending on the version that you have in front of you, is slanderer. And so when we think about that, even from the beginning, as God is setting up foundational laws, we talk about the Ten Commandments and how while, again, we're not under the old law, a lot of the Ten Commandments should still, in a sense, govern our lives. We think about the fact that while God may have changed how He has His people, certain people, you're not born that way, but you can be who are you if you're God's people, and now you're a part of God's family if you are baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, add to the church. That might have changed, but He still set up a lot of fundamental things for us to live by, and this is one even from the very beginning here. And then let's notice, secondly, that it is often listed among some serious, and I put that in quotation marks there because what's a serious sin, right? I don't know. But go back to what I said just a moment ago, again, when we list serious sin, we would talk about murder. We might talk about certain things, sexual sins. But then we might try to reclassify some other things, right? We take lying and we call it like white lies, right? Little white lies. We try to group it and say, well, that's not as bad. At least I didn't kill somebody. And I guess, yes, in a sense, there's some truth to that. But if I ask you what's covered in Romans chapter 1, I don't know if you're familiar enough with Romans chapter 1, last time you studied it, but if you probably ask a lot of people, or certainly most preachers, we would talk about homosexuality, right? That's what's covered here. I don't know in your Bible, but you go back to beginning about verse 18 down through verse 24, and it's talking a little bit about these people who are unrighteous. You go over to verse number 28, and it says, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind. Again, what do you think of when you think of a debased mind, right? We would say, well, that's somebody in prison. That's somebody who's done the worst of the worst, to do those things which are not fitting. At the end of verse 28. Look at verse 29. It begins, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, comes up there, envy, murder. And it's real easy to stop. Right? We've hit the big sins. We've hit the serious sins. But you keep going. Strife, deceit, evil-mindedness, they are, and here's an important word when we're going to talk about gossip, whispers. Whispers. How do you usually tell gossip sometimes? Maybe there's a little bit of a mental image there when it comes to gossip. It's sometimes done in a whisper, done in a quieted voice, because you don't want people to hear what you're saying. And then in verse 30, backbiters, haters of God, going on down through the rest, including in finishing verse 32, that those who practice such things are deserving of death. Not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. When we think about this idea of gossip, it's something that God has covered for a long time as something that's very serious. And even it's often listed in the New Testament, especially with some of Paul's lists among things that we need to be on guard about. It's not something that's not a big deal. It's not something that should be joked about necessarily, but it's something that we should take seriously as we're considering the things of our life and how we live. I would even go so far as to say as well, probably, most of us don't have a problem with murder. Most of us may not have a problem with alcohol. We may not have a problem with certain things. But what are some of the things that can trip us up? We talked last week about materialism. Materialism is something that'd be very easy in the world we live in to trip us up. That kind of gets a hold of our life and leads us astray. And what about gossip? Maybe that's part of this as well. Let's talk for just a few moments. Let's define gossip. All right, let me hear from you first. I've got some definitions I think are pretty good, but I think we could kind of spread it around a little bit. How would you define gossip? Unnecessary talking. John, my kids do a lot of unnecessary talking. I don't know if they're gossiping, but that's a different story too. So they were doing that at supper tonight, actually, some of them. But now, unnecessary talking. I think that's a good start. What else? Very good. Tend to, generally, those are some words we'll use. Generally, tearing somebody down. I think that's a very good point. I've got that here in just a minute. What else? Excuse me. Hearsay. Okay. Hearsay is another word that kind of goes along with that. Absence of evidence. Okay. Think that's connected? Anybody else? Okay. I think that can be a part of it. A lot of things that are true that may not need to be repeated. I think that's good as well. Anybody else?
Sometimes it's more tempting to solve a problem with somebody by talking to somebody else instead of that person.
Very good point. It's tempting to try to solve something by talking to somebody else rather than the person. I think that's a good point as well. One definition was telling other people's information. Right? Maybe back to John's point, not necessarily good or bad, not necessarily true or false, just telling somebody else's information. Merriam-Webster would say that it's a rumor or report of an intimate nature. Rumor or report of an intimate nature. Kind of the dictionary definition, if you just straight Google it, says casual or unconstrained conversation or reports about other people, typically involving details that are not confirmed as being true. So we kind of started hitting on some of these things. Lack of evidence, not necessarily being true, as we talked about several of these. I'd like to share with you one. Let's do this biblical one first. Look at Proverbs chapter 20. If you have a Bible handy and you're going to be following along, we're going to spend a good bit of time in Proverbs tonight. Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 19. He who goes about as a talebearer, there's that word again, reveals secrets. That's the New King James. You may have something a little different there, but that's the New King James. Involving secrets. You see that in some of these things. Doesn't necessarily always have to be secrets, but when we commonly think of gossip, it may be something that others don't know. And maybe that's something that could be true. Maybe it's something that's not true. Again, it can be wide-ranging just a little bit. Let me share one with you that I heard Kyle Butt give in a lesson that was found on PTP 365, I think from maybe a couple of years ago at Polishing the Pulpit. But he kind of took it step by step here, and we've already talked about some of these. But he says, if you're trying to understand if a conversation you had or someone coming to you with something to say is gossip or not, here's some things kind of going down a list. Number one, if it's gossip, it's almost always about another person, right? That's kind of one of the first hallmarks there of it being gossip. Number two, that person is not there, right? They're usually not present. You're not bringing them over to have this conversation. They're somewhere else, maybe even in the same room, maybe not, but they are not there. Often you don't want it to be known what's being said, right? Again, kind of back that idea of a whisper, a hushed tone. You don't necessarily want it known what you're telling somebody about somebody else who's usually not there. And then here, kind of again, as Benny said just a moment ago, it usually shows a fault or tries to tear down someone's character. For instance, if I came over here to Freddie and I said, Freddie, that Jerry Douglas is the strongest Christian I know. He reads his Bible every day. Is that gossip? Well, I'm talking about somebody else, and he may not be there, but am I tearing him down? Or it'd be something that I wouldn't want to be known to be said? Or might I go tell Charlie, hey, Charlie, you need to talk to Jerry. Jerry's a good man, reads his Bible every, good, strong Christian. Kind of a little facetious about it there, but we begin to see what we're talking about when we talk about this. And of course, the other thing we would add in is that it's generally unconfirmed. That's not every single time. It may be that you witness something. And of course, we won't even get into the fact that sometimes you can witness something that's not really what you think it is, right? You can see somebody in a location or coming out of a spot and you assume you know what's going on, and there may be a legitimate reason, not always, but sometimes. But it's unconfirmed what you might have seen or heard. And so when we define it, those are some hallmarks there. That's kind of what we're talking about here when we talk about gossip. Let me hear from you again, though. Let's go a little bit further. Why? Why do people gossip sometimes? Do what? It's easy. I didn't have that down, but that's very good. It's easy. Absolutely easy. Especially if it doesn't have to have any truth to it, right? Yeah, Benny? All right, makes them feel better about themselves. Charlie? That's what you're going to say? Yeah, that's that's a good one there. Makes them feel better about themselves. Anybody else? Power, that's pretty good. Jealousy, I think that's a good one. Just to hurt somebody. Of course, a lot of these are saying similar things. You understand that, but absolutely that's true. Turn in your Bible real quick to Psalm 41. Psalm 41 and verse 7. I've got several of those down. I'll throw my list up here real quick, but makes me feel better. Power, I'd put that down. What about kind of in connected with power, and as Charlie, I think, was getting at there, we just sometimes want to be in the know, right? We just want to be in the know. We kind of want to be people that know things. We kind of know everything, and it gives us a sense of power, as if we have power over people. Psalm 41 and verse number 7 says, all who hate me whisper together against me. Against me they devise my hurt. It's kind of mentioned as well in Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 18, the idea of foolishness and hatred. But there are probably several reasons we could say. As we mentioned, it makes me feel better about myself if I know something else about somebody, especially if it tears them down, makes them seem like they're not any good. And it can give us a sense of power over others. And I think Cameron's right down the line there, and I hadn't even thought about it that way, but it's just easy sometimes. How fast, we had a lesson on the tongue a few Sundays ago, right? But how fast our words come out so often that we wish we could reach our hand out and grab them and pull them back, but it's too late. How fast do we, cut? How deep do we cut with our tongue when we're hurt, right? And we just are hurt and we're upset. And what's the easiest thing to do? The easiest thing to do is to say something hateful, say something that's not true, say something that might be considered gossip. It's easy to do that. And so those are just a few reasons there of why people kind of get involved. Let me give you one more here. I had this in my notes, but I didn't know where to kind of discuss it. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 8. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 8. And we kind of said this, but some people just like it, right? Some people just enjoy it. Proverbs 18 and verse 8. The words of a talebearer are like tasty trifles. What's the word we use sometimes about gossip? It's juicy, right? We got that juicy gossip. The idea of something that tastes good, something that we would want. You think about a big piece of juicy steak or something. We got that juicy gossip. People just like it. It tastes good in a sense to some people. The words of a talebearer are like tasty trifles, and they go down into the inmost body. You see other things about our words there in chapter 18. If you're still there in Proverbs 18, verse 4, the words of a man's mouth, verse 6, a fool's lips, a fool's mouth, verse 7, lots and lots of warning. I told you last week, sometimes we as preachers or teachers, we get caught up in, classifying things. We'll say, well, the Bible talks X amount about money. We said that last week. Some people try to classify and say, well, so much of Jesus' words are about money or materialism, that kind of thing. When in reality, a lot of things are covered. Same thing is true about our words, right? A lot of scripture, book of James, we spent a lot of time there that day on the tongue, book of Proverbs, a lot of it's about our words. And included in that is this idea of gossip. Say it again. What did you?
It says that they are
As womb, okay.
instead of dainty. In the other versions say dainty morsels and things like
Yeah.
that. Those don't seem to correspond.
They don't, but they seem to kind of both cover the thing, right? Kind of interesting. That kind of both sides of it in a sense. They do. Yeah, and I have a note here in my Bible, just kind of off the cuff, that says, a Jewish tradition. So it may just be in how we got the Bible and that kind of discussion of the translation and transmission of the Bible there and those kinds of things. But it is interesting that it does. It kind of covers both of it. Either way you want to read it, in a sense, it's going to remind us of the importance of these things. Turning your Bible real quick to Matthew chapter 11. I'm going to hold on the next slide for just a minute before I go along with the slides. But Matthew chapter 11. If I ask you, was Jesus ever gossiped about or the target of gossip? What would you think? What would you say? Matthew chapter 11 in verse 19, Jesus seems to say, this exact thing, although maybe not in the context that we think of. But in Matthew chapter 11, he's talking, there's a lot here about John the Baptizer as he's sending messengers to Jesus at the beginning of this, and Jesus begins to talk about this. But he says in verse 18, "For John came neither eating nor drinking." And so here's what they're saying about John, right? That's kind of the idea here. This is the way John behaved, so this is what they're saying about John. Then in verse 19, "The Son of Man came eating and drinking." And so now they're saying about the Son of Man, about Jesus, "Look, a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners." And then he concludes this section by saying, "But wisdom is justified by her children." You might not have thought about this if I asked you how Jesus might have been talked about, or he might have been the target of gossip. But he's saying here that, John acted, we might say, in a bit of a different way, in such a way that it was apparent to people, this is John the Baptist. And so then they said that he must be a demon, or has a demon. And Jesus came and he ate and he drank and he went to weddings, right? Is what he did. He went to weddings and he went to dinners. So what they said about him was, must be a drunkard. This Son of Man, this Jesus, must be a drunkard because he's attending these weddings. And, once again, let's go all the way back to Leviticus. People are always willing to talk, and they're always willing to talk about others. If we went backwards in our slides, we could pull up that list again. But about people who are not there, about people who are easy targets, as Cameron said just a few moments ago, people are always willing to do that. People are always willing to try to feel power. People are always willing to try to make themselves feel better. And so when we do that, then, this talking about others is going to be a problem, whether it's Jesus for some people or whether it's, we might consider the lesser of people of some sort. Yeah, Ms. Faye? Trying to put people down. Yeah, they're trying to slander. Back to that idea again of slandering someone is kind of a part of this. Yeah. And so the fickle people can't be satisfied with either one. For sure. Can't be satisfied with either one at all. So we could go a lot of different directions with this. I'd like to take it and just keep going with our thoughts a little bit. And this is from Jeremy Pate, who works with Apologetics Press. I don't know that you all would have done it here in the auditorium, but in some of our younger classes, we would use the material for VBS, and especially in our class, we watched videos each night where Jeremy would do kind of introduction, working with those guys down there at AP, but does a good job. He did a lesson, and there were two different sessions from, I think, last year and this year at Polishing the Pulpit, one in Sevierville and one at Branson this year in Missouri, but ask a lot of questions about gossip. Some questions that might make us think about gossip. How do I stop? How do I deal with someone? How do I deal when somebody's talking about me? They have these things that Polishing the Pulpit, a lot of times they'll call them 7 minutes of wisdom. So they'll have about 4 or 5 guys will get up, and they'll each just have about 7 minutes to kind of get through a short question. And so these kind of overlap, but they were challenging. He had one in particular that said, "Can you participate in gossip if you do not say anything?" Can you participate if you do not say anything? I want to answer that. I want to look at some of the things that he pointed out. I wanted to be sure and give him the credit for that. But as you think about that, there's a couple different ways you could look at that, right? Is it possible is one way, and we might say yes, it is possible. You can walk up on a group or be a part of a group and people start gossiping and you not say anything, and it is possible that you're participating. We're going to kind of look at that in a sense here. And so the thing that he said that I thought was very interesting is passively participating presents problems. That's what we'd like to think we can do, right? Is we're just kind of passive. We just kind of walk up on a group. We're kind of on the outskirts. We have nothing to do with it. It's not a big deal. I can kind of say, well, I wasn't doing it. But you're still sort of passively participating. And in the end, that really presents some problems. Let's look at a few of those. Number one, it presents the problem of association. The problem of association. In Proverbs chapter 17 and verse number 4, it says, "An evildoer gives heed to false lips. A liar listens eagerly to a spiteful tongue," or a destructive tongue. Once again, I'm usually reading from the New King James here. What does it say? A liar listens I mean, don't you have to be saying something to lie? I mean, I guess in a sense, but a liar listens eagerly to a destructive or a spiteful tongue. Here's the deal. He said, Jeremy said, you cannot gossip by yourself, right? He said, if you find somebody gossiping by themselves, you might need to have a talk with them. They have some other problems if they're gossiping by themselves. You cannot gossip by yourself. It's not possible. You got nobody else to tell it to. I mean, then we talk about maybe having evil thoughts or something like that, but you certainly can't be guilty of gossiping by yourself. There has to be others involved, and so even if you think you're passively standing by, you are involved in a sense, and there is an association with that. Proverbs chapter 26 and verse number 20. I love this one. If you've ever heard this one before, it's a great one. Proverbs 26 and verse number 20. Where there is no wood, the fire goes out. Just seems simple enough, right? It's a good life lesson. We'll take the young men camping. We might need to know that if there's no more wood, then the fire's going to go out. And where there is no talebearer, strife ceases. No hearers. If there's no hearers, then it's going to go out. The gospel's going to stop because you cannot gossip by yourself in a sense. So there is a problem. A problem when we think we are passively participating is association. We're involved with that. I don't know. We don't have time to go around the room. Most of us wouldn't want to go around the room, of course. But if we could go around the room and we could give a situation where something was said about us, or we were involved with a situation of gossip, and maybe it came back down to where two people are having this problem and they're talking about it, and the person who's been hurt says, well, I heard that you were there, and you were there, and you were there, and you were there. And I mean, you mean you didn't stand up for me? You didn't tell them to stop? All right, there's a problem of association. And so while we might want to make ourselves feel better, we might want to soothe our conscience by saying, I didn't say anything. I just stood there. Well, passive participation also can cause a problem because you're associated with it. And if we will simply take away all the fuel, if we'll take away all the wood, if we'll take away all the tails and the talebearers, then the strife will cease. There will be no problem. So when we think about this idea of trying to make ourselves feel better by saying that, we might reconsider. Number two, then, another problem is approval. There is a problem of approval. Look at Ephesians chapter 5 and verse number 11. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse number 11. If we are trying to stand around and act like we're not a part of it, then that's not going to work because we are still giving our approval in a sense. Notice Paul says here, and have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. So again, I caution you. Maybe it's not you, maybe it's not, but for many people, I think we make ourselves feel better when we classify things and we say, well, I am not a part of darkness. If you want to claim darkness, that's those evil people in the world, the mass murderers, the serial killers. I mean, really dark people who have lots of problems, really sinful people who continue to live their lives. That's darkness. I'm not a part of darkness. And so that must not be me. But of course, if we're talking about sin, we're talking about sin. That joke of serious sins was kind of in quotation marks for a reason, that we would be cautioned against doing that. But he goes on, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. There's a part A, in a sense, in which we need to stay away. We should not be a part of it at all. But then part B here is that we should also then expose them, right? When we go along and just sort of stay silent, we're giving silent approval to what's being said or done. Again, if a group of folks are standing around and whether they're gossiping or whether they're making a plan and you don't say anything and, the thing happens, everyone's say, well, wait a minute, you didn't say anything. You didn't stop us. You didn't try to say anything. You just went along. Silent approval is still giving your approval. In James chapter 4 and verse number 17, James chapter 4 and verse 17, James here would write, therefore to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. The problem with standing around in this kind of mental picture, standing on the outskirts of a circle, maybe on the outside of a group, trying to pretend that you are, not a part of it, you're not giving your approval or your association, is as you are standing there silently, you know that this is not good. You know that it's wrong. But yet you're not stopping anybody. And again, in a sense, you are not doing the good that should be done, that you know that needs to be done here. So there is a problem of approval here. Yes, Ms. Wayne? You can always walk off. I mean, sure. There's a lot of tough situations we find ourselves in sometimes. It takes a lot of courage to do things. A lot of us have lived in various situations on different ends of the spectrum of that, but yes. Sure. And that even extends the outside of just gossip, as you're saying, other things they may be talking about. I mean, whether it's just lewd talk or whether it's just, any number of things, we can always usually separate ourselves to some degree from that and show our disapproval if we know it's something. You can take action. Well, what if I'm against the wall? What if I'm the one in the corner against the wall? I guess you can turn around. I don't know. You do something, to show your disapproval, to try to get away from it. Instead of sort of taking this approach that we said is, as well, I didn't say anything. That's an excuse, as we would say. One more here. What about awareness? What about awareness? I don't really have a passage here, but I thought this was pretty interesting, a couple points that Jeremy brought out. But when we think about participating, even if it's in a bit of a passive sense, one of the problems that comes up from that is just simple awareness. It'll change the way you think about somebody, right? I mean, even if it's not true. Maybe you find out later it's not true, but you might have heard enough that you thought it was true, right? And it'll change the way you think about somebody. It'll affect you so much that whether they understand it fully or not, or know that you were there or not, you will always have this thing in your mind that you knew maybe they were involved with something, or maybe not the whole truth was told, but at least a partial truth was told. It'll change the way that you think about somebody, and that can be a problem. And of course, then it's incredibly tempting to share. I mean, it's just that's always going to be there then, right or wrong. I mean, hopefully if you find out something that's not true, you wouldn't share it, of course, but maybe that doesn't come till much later. And it changes your awareness because, I mean, just like when you have something you want to tell people about, it's hard to keep it in. It's hard not to share that. And when we hear something, it's incredibly tempting to keep it inside and not share it with others. So we have this awareness about a situation that will present a problem for us because we're gonna kind of struggle with that. Thoughts or comments or questions here?
When you realize that there's been lies told, doctrine that's just flat out false, then trying to chase down and correct the error that somebody's been told, you can't do it. You cannot. It'll kill you if you're trying to make everybody realize that was a bald-faced lie. Then you can't chase it down. If you do the best you can trying to, but ultimately you just have to say, okay, you'll know in judgment that that was a lie.
Yeah.
Because you simply cannot. It's the old proverbial busting a feather pillow and throwing the feather. You never get all the feathers back in the pillow.
No, it does, damage that will last for a long, long time. And I mean, that's absolutely true from just the most careless thing. I heard a preacher in one of the Polishing the Pulpit, the 7-minute videos, or in his 7 minutes, he talked about a time where he was guilty of gossip. And he kind of found out, realized it. I mean, a little bit inadvertently maybe, but realized it and, started trying to go back. And fortunately for him, it was a little less, deep. It didn't spread as far, but he talks about the pain, of having to go back to somebody and tell something, try to fix something. I mean, sitting down with somebody at the table and saying, I'm sorry because I did this. I heard something. And not only the person who it was about, but the person who originally said it, right? I mean, this person comes to him, and so when he finds out maybe it's not true, he goes back to them or whatever, and then she says, well, you didn't tell him it was me, did you? You didn't tell him I said it. Well, I mean, but going to both of them and sitting down and having that conversation is difficult and causes damage. And even to Frey's point, even if it was a little smaller and you can kind of contain it a little, the cuts are there. I mean, the scars are there. And he almost with tears was relaying the story of, I will never forget how difficult that conversation was to have with someone on both sides and try to fix that situation. And that's absolutely true. Charlie?
the other inmates find out that they committed the crime that they've been accused of, they will take care of it.
It can do a lot of damage. And I don't want to, we don't have to get political with all this, right? But the idea that misinformation can do a lot of power for people. I mean, that, just sometimes sharing something, back to the idea of why do people do it? Some people do it for power. If I can just spread a little bit of false information about somebody else, then I can weaken their candidacy, or I can, try to take them down, or mess with their family or whatever. And it may be not true, and they know it's not true when they say it, but they still know the power of words and spreading some of that. And so we just, we need to be really careful with what we say. Is, of course, the ultimate thing. I don't have any kind of answers to tell you, exactly how to handle it. Kind of back to, if you have your Bible, turn to Matthew 18 real quick. Turn to Matthew 18. Because when I talk about problems, I talk about problems among people, and talk about dealing with things, then Matthew chapter 18 is what we usually say, right? Matthew chapter 18, beginning in verse 15, going through verse 20. You want to always grab verse 20 and attach it onto that, right? Because in verse 20, when it says, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I am there in the midst of them." One of those verses that's usually kind of chipped off and taken out of context, right, for people to do what they want to with it. But in connection, it's dealing with this idea here. Matthew 18 in verse 15 talks about this idea of going to somebody, right? But can I suggest for you that I don't think we usually use this in terms of gossip. Always. We don't think, if I ask you a good gossip passage, or what would help us in studying about gossip, we probably wouldn't think this most of the time. We think about a lot of other things, but with gossip, with what we hear, what do we do with it? And ultimately, that's kind of the answer. As Freddie said, trying to stop it in its tracks, even though sometimes when you start trying to chase it down, you find out it's real difficult. You just keep pulling and pulling and pulling at that thread. But trying to stop it where it is, going to the person, trying to maybe stop someone who's telling you something, trying to be sure you're not passing it along. All those things are easy to say, but it's real hard to practice. Back to that idea of sometimes we just like it. It's just hearing things, tickling of the ears, we might say. We have to work hard at it. And so...
think that we have a responsibility to each other to do that.
Kind of back to what Freddie was saying a moment ago about, trying to put all the feathers back in. You think about, we emphasized this, and I preached the lesson back several months ago, but the idea of God's second law of pardon. Coming to the front pew. Why do we do that? Why do we make a public sin? Why do we confess in a public way, let it be known, so that we can try to put it back? But kind of back to the example that I always use, of course, being a parent and a dad of something happening at the ballpark, maybe, losing your cool and, cussing, throwing things, getting thrown out of the park, whatever, and then repenting and coming, in and saying before the church, I did this, I'm sorry for that, I realize I was wrong. One thing we can do is try to go to bat for each other. But as Freddie's saying, you think about, we got down here at the ballpark any given Saturday, if it's a tournament here, there's people from Grundy, there's people from Pikeville. It's going to be impossible to get all that out. Now, the best we can do sometimes is start right here before God and before our brethren, saying we're sorry and we were wrong. And that's a bit of a different situation, maybe in just anger, losing your cool. But same thing with saying something, or gossiping about people. We have an opportunity to step up for each other, to try to say something that's helpful and encouraging, and try to put a stop to that. But man, it's really, really hard. But yes, going to the person, of course, trying to stop the person maybe that said it, if you can, if you know. If not, you can certainly give some sort of answer or stop to that situation, and then try to find out for yourself as best you can. Cameron? Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Which then we're back to Matthew 18. Cameron's making a good point there, that we're back to Matthew 18, which is there is an appropriate way to handle something. You can say something so what we're saying is it's not always wrong to say something, bad about someone if it's true, but only in the appropriate way. If somebody's bringing it to Paul in that sense to say, hey, this needs to kind of be dealt with, Paul, in his position of authority, is able to try to handle those things. That's not trying to stop sin. In fact, in 1 Corinthians there, when Paul is talking about those things, he's kind of making the point that you guys have let it go on so long. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, it's just become accepted. Nobody would stop it. Nobody would say anything. Something's got to be said. He talks there in that passage about the fact that we do sometimes need to judge one another, make a righteous judgment of a sense, to say, hey, what he says here, a man has his father's wife, that's wrong. It shouldn't be done. Somebody needs to stand up and say that, and that's not gossip. Now, there might be an appropriate way. Again, as I said, we're back to Matthew 18 kind of a little bit of how we deal with it. It's not always wrong just to say something, but we do need to consider the situation. And then we can go back. I think I had much else after that. Yeah, but let me go back here just a second. But back to Kyle's definition there, you can say something that's about somebody else. You can say something that's about somebody else when they're not there if you're having a meeting with the elders, if you feel like that's the route that needs to be taken. But is it something that's trying to tear down? Or is it something that's unconfirmed or something that you did witness or to be true that you're bringing before the elders to try to help deal with it? There are ways, if we're checking all these boxes, chances are it's gossip. But we don't always have to check those to try to deal with something or say something that's true. Absolutely. What else here? We got just a couple of minutes left. Any other thoughts or comments? Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no helpful intent. That's pretty good. And I think you're kind of back, Patrick's on lines with number 3 there. Like typically you don't want it to be known. You're saying it in whispered tones. You're saying it over in the corner. You don't want anybody else to hear that kind of things. It's not helpful in any kind of sense. One of the preachers in his 7 minutes talked about thinking before you speak, and that, using all those letters. You may have heard that before. Is it true? Is it helpful? Something that goes along with each of those. If we're thinking more along those lines, then we might be, hopefully we're on the right track. And we're trying to help someone or stop something. I would just, caution you and encourage you to think about all that you say. You think, man, that's a lot. Yeah, it is sometimes. But in all that you say, what is your intent? Are you trying to be helpful? Are you just trying to talk about somebody? Are you trying to share something that others don't want known? That was kind of back to the one before this here, but the more general definition. But just telling other people's information, is that it? Proverbs 20, verse 19, are you just telling secrets? Again, back to the fact it may be true, but it may be something that somebody doesn't want known or is not sharing just yet for some reason. Maybe it's a secret that they have that maybe isn't even sinful in a sense, at some point there. I did hear one preacher say, he said, I can tell you, I can give you the help. You need to deal with gossip. He said, the next time that somebody comes up to you and tries to, say, hey, let me tell you what I heard. Let me tell you about so-and-so. He said, what you need to do is you need to tell them, hold on just a minute. I'm going to go get some pen and paper, and we're going to write all this down. You tell me everything you want to tell me. We're going to write it all down, and then I need you to sign it. And then when you're done, if there's a problem, we'll know who to go to, right? You do that, probably they're going to stop right there. And you might find out that, you can stop a lot of gossip in its tracks. Now, maybe you're the one gossiping. That's kind of a different story sometimes. We need help with that. But yeah, if you ask somebody, are you willing to put your name to it? Kind of back to that story of the preacher. When he went to that woman, she said, you didn't tell her it was me. You didn't tell her who said it, right? That's the way we treat it. Yeah. Yeah. Back to intent, what's the goal there? So sometimes we can identify it. Sometimes we get caught up in the moment. But we just always need to be careful. And of course, Proverbs is full of this. But as we mentioned from Paul's writing, Ephesians kind of full of it too. Some of the other of Paul's epistles are full of watch your tongue. You go to Timothy, Paul's epistle to Timothy, about what the women are to be doing and how they're to be teaching the younger women. You know what it says? It says, don't be a backbiter. Don't be a slanderer. Teach them not to do those things. So it's something that's definitely a temptation and difficult for us. And may we just do our best to be careful with that as we go throughout our lives. So thank you for your attention and comments. We'll pick up then there next week.